Okay, Megan, thank you very much. Yes, my first webinar with Curlew Action as a trustee. And somebody asked me today, actually, well, why do you choose this particular conservation charity? And it's very simple. I love Curlews all my life, so I've been in the corporate world an awful lot. And when I got back to the UK and retired from my IT corporate life, I looked around me, wow, the new normals out there and how everything had declined because I've been abroad a lot. And so one of the things I want to do is to really, really put the rest of my life back into what I can do for conservation. So Curlew Action is one of my key charities. And the other one I actually work for is Atlantic Salmon Trust, which also has an endangered species in it as well, on the poor Atlantic salmon. So those are the two things I'm working on. So first of all, thank you very much everyone attending this webinar. And particularly thank you to our four speakers who I'll introduce to you all in a minute. We didn't know when we set this webinar up, but it's quite topical with a general election coming on. We have at the moment a coalition of 82 conservation bodies lined up taking the government to court about not being on target to meet our 2030 goals for biodiversity, water quality, air pollution and waste reduction. So whichever government comes out on top on July the 4th, they will have their work cut out. And you'll also see many pledges on the election for we have a housing crisis, and I'm sure everyone will be competing to see how many houses they're going to build. That's always a challenge every year, how many they really build. But of course, when you talk about those competing priorities, often that will mean a problem with habitats and what we're talking about, curlews, but obviously not just curlews, we're talking about the whole set of waders and all that habitat as well and how we look after that. So there are competing priorities there, and how do we deal with them? So I think it's a very topical subject for today, and it'll roll on. So let me first of all introduce the four speakers, and then we'll come back and start with Carl first. So Carl, we have here, Carl Bunnage. He's the head of nature policy at RSPB, and he's going to talk about how the RSPB approach to development. We have Jonathan Wildgoose, who's owns a house developer, Wildgoose, and he's going to particularly focus on biodiversity net gain. What does that mean to him as a developer? Then we have Chloe Pritchard, who is a principal ecologist. She's here in her own capacity, and she's going to give some examples of development and how she's worked on particular areas from an ecology point of view, and particularly talking about waders. And then Pete Potts, who probably wants to call himself a waderology, but he's an ecologist as well, with a particular specialization in ornithology. But he's really way down the wadeology route, as if there was such a term. I think we'll understand that when you see his presentation. So thank you all very, very much for coming on here tonight. We'll go through each presentation. As Megan says, you can put your questions in the chat. But we've got a great set of people here who should be able to answer many of your questions. So without ado, Carl, can I put it across to you? Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. It's really good to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for that introduction. My current MP has a particular interest in the outcome of the election because he happens to be the current Prime Minister. So it's a very live issue up here, as it is everywhere else. Okay, I'll share a presentation. So hopefully you will be able to see something up here in a minute. If not, please shout out. But as John says, I'm Carl Bunnage. I'm head of nature policy for RSPB England. By way of a bit of context, really, about me, I'm a chartered planner by trade, so an urban and regional planner, but with a lifelong passion for nature since being a little kid, way down there near the carpet. My professional life, most of that has been spent in local government and public-private sector partnerships, often working in regeneration and placemaking capacities, but finishing with strategic planning and a range of built a natural heritage functions at county level within the local authority sector. So I've seen the planning and development process, if you like, from both sides of the perspective. I've worked very closely with developers and been part of that process of bringing development and placemaking forward, but also very much in the current role from a conservation perspective. Current role since 2020 is, as I say, with RSPB England, sitting within our policy and advocacy function with a broad range of policy responsibilities, but in particular taking a lead on planning policy matters for RSPB England. Our work, as always, in this sector is done as an individual organisation, but also in partnership and collaboration with others, including Wildlife and Countryside Link, professional institutions such as the RTPI, the Royal Town Planning Institute, which is my institution, and development and commercial sector partners such as Barratt Homes, which I'll speak more of shortly. So a little bit of context really about the scale and nature of pressure on the environment and nature currently coming through from development. The most recent figures, and these are year ending June 2023, so there'll be a new set hopefully coming out before too long, showed that there were 381,000 planning applications in England alone in that year. And that covers a vast range from very small scale things to major developments. 86% of those were consented. So most of this large number of applications actually ends up happening, or at least being consented. And they're driven from primarily a number of key drivers. One is the push for economic growth in the face of the cost of a living crisis that's being so prominent in election campaigns at the moment. So the push for economic growth is driving a lot of development pressure. The housing crisis, with leading parties in recent years having broadly committed to developing around 300,000 new homes per year each. Not actually achieving it entirely, but that's been the commitment, that's been the ambition. The rush to net zero energy, so heading for net zero energy with a green and a renewable energy transition and securing energy security for the country is another major driver, and that's particularly beginning to impact on Curlew and other waders in upland areas. Infrastructure renewal, both to drive that growth, but also to replace crumbling and ageing infrastructure across the country, but also in respect of government policy initiatives aimed at tackling some of those issues. So, for example, free ports and investment zones. Now, free ports can involve taxation and planning deregulation in various ways within targeted areas. Much of that is quite localised, often within a port environment, but the outer boundaries of free ports actually can extend many miles inland, encompassing entire cities such as Southampton and parts of national parks, including Dartmoor and the North York Moors. So there are a whole range of pressures and an awful lot of development activity happening. I won't go through that, but stating the obvious, we're a small country. We're a small island, densely populated, an awful lot of competing pressures for land that have to be reconciled in some way. When you look at the amount of land that, for example, is farmed, 69%, compared to the amount of it that's actually set aside and designated for nature conservation or is owned by conservation charities, that's a relatively small proportion. So we need some mechanism for trying to reconcile all these various competing interests for land in a very densely populated country. The drivers of biodiversity loss that system really has to tackle and take into account are relatively few, I guess, in cause, but significant in effect. The first one of those is habitat loss, which we all recognise, substantial habitat loss across the country over the past few decades. Agricultural land management is a big issue, particularly high intensity agricultural activity. both through monoculture, through agricultural pollution and runoff, etc. Built development, which is probably the focus mostly of our discussions tonight. Again, a substantial cause of habitat loss and of biodiversity loss across the country when done inappropriately and badly. But there are opportunities for built development to actually be a beneficial thing for nature, as we will touch on. It's very difficult actually to put a number on the effect of built development on biodiversity loss. It's not something that's actually measured and quantified in any one place. There is the potential for academic research to look into that, but at the moment it's very difficult to actually quantify it, but we know it's significant. Climate change, no escaping from that one, another major driver. And finally, people's disconnection with nature increasingly, and that fueling the constant resetting of the benchmark as to what constitutes biodiversity abundance. So I go back to what I can remember seeing as a kid 40, 50 years ago and compare that to what we have now. But that pales into insignificance compared to what my father would have seen at the same age, and so on if you go back. So we're constantly seeing this reduction in biodiversity, but it's becoming a norm. And people are failing to recognise just how depleted we really are and what the baseline really ought to look like. Okay, so the planning system. This is arguably the principal means through which we should be seeking to reconcile these various competing demands and pressures upon land. Our system in the UK is pretty unique globally. There isn't one really that directly compares to it. It's devolved. It's a devolved function around the UK. So there are slightly different systems in each of the 4 countries. It's a discretionary system. So it very much it is very much framed around judging individual development application and proposals on their merits, unlike some systems elsewhere in the world which tend to rely on much more formal zoning type of models. It's plan-led. So those decisions should be governed by a plan, a local plan in most cases. There are different ways in which decisions can be processed, or applications can be considered, and determinations can be reached. Most applications come through what's called the Town and Country Planning Act process. So that's the vast majority of things. By and large, they will go to local councils for a decision, and that decision will be taken by locally elected representatives. Bigger projects, particularly major infrastructure projects, go down a different route called the NSIP route, Nationally Significant Infrastructure Projects, which are determined by the Secretary of State in government. So there are different processes for different types of application. Some of those, as I mentioned, are determined locally. Some of those are determined nationally. The extent to which nature is taken into account in those processes can therefore vary according to which route they take. One of the features of our planning system in recent years has been constant change. Nothing basically has remained terribly static for very long over the last 2 decades or so, possibly going back longer. There's been constant change to the planning system, which has led to it becoming ever more complex and ever more difficult to administer, and arguably ever more dysfunctional. What we have had is a system, because of that change, that particularly from an environmental protection point of view, has been, I would argue, significantly weakened in many areas, and is definitely under-resourced. So the resources that local planning authorities and the statutory consultees, such as Natural England, have available to them to engage with the planning system are currently insufficient, particularly within the public sector, with around about only a third of local planning authorities within councils having access, for example, to specialist ecological expertise on their books. And it's also been driven, arguably, it's been increasingly loaded towards development. I think many would argue within the sector over recent decades, particularly with a presumption in favour of sustainable development. So the starting point is that things should be approved, unless there are very strong reasons why they shouldn't. and more recently, in respect of nationally significant infrastructure projects, a thing called the critical national priority status. Basically means that major energy investments are of national significance and should not be questioned in principle. And that status actually trumps and overrides most environmental protections. So it's a system that is very much loaded towards development while still maintaining some checks and balances for the environment. Coming out of all that are a number of issues and opportunities. One of the issues is the fragmentation of decision making. Some of these decisions are taken nationally, some are taken locally, some are taken by district councils, some by county councils, some by combined authorities. It varies in different parts of the country and in relation to different types of application. We're also dealing with a very complex administrative geography of local authorities and councils. As I say, counties and districts, unitaries, combined authorities, metro mayors. So very complex geography, all of which are producing plans, in particular local plans of some description, which collectively ought to be connecting and adding up to something that's strategically coherent. Very, very difficult when you've got such a complex geography of political organisations to work with. There's also a significant disconnection between planning at land and on sea. So our terrestrial and our marine planning systems are not terribly well connected. Our marine planning system is probably more dysfunctional actually than our land-based system. But that does really begin to kick in when you consider issues such as offshore wind, where the turbines will be determined under a marine planning system, but that power has to be brought on land through cables and through transmission lines, which are dealt with through a terrestrial planning system. And when those two systems are not terribly well connected, it's not terribly helpful. But there are opportunities in relation, in particular, and for example, biodiversity net gain, which has a real potential to be a force for good for nature, to generate some uplift on the back of development if it's done well. And there are flaws in the system, but we'll hopefully hear much more about, I think, an interesting perspective on it in one of our other presentations. So RSPB's position in relation to all this. Firstly, we're not anti-development. We are not one of Liz Truss's anti-growth coalition members in that sense. We recognise that nature and people both need homes. People need energy. We need community and social infrastructure. It has to go somewhere. It's a question now of working with nature in the planning and delivery of that rather than working against it. So what we would look for is much more nature friendly, much more nature positive development coming forward than we've tended to see a lot of in the past. We also have developed under that ethos a number of partnerships, corporate partnerships with organisations in the commercial and development sector. And those some examples of that are included on the slide that hopefully you can see in front of you, particularly Barratt Homes, where we brought forward with them a 2,500 home scheme called Kingsbrook at Aylesbury, where we're showcasing nature-friendly design for new housing and have taken government ministers and departments and a whole range of other influential stakeholders to see. And Light Rock Power, which is a solar power company who we work with to ensure high biodiversity and ecological outcomes from the work that they do. And an example of that has a direct impact for Curlew is at Long Pasture solar farm, which is just north of Darlington, not a million miles from where I am up here in North Yorkshire. There, a proposal for a solar farm was designed in collaboration with us. The design resulted in a 51% uplift on biodiversity net gain for habitats, 117% for hedgerows. That's way in excess of a 10% requirement. But also included a 13-hectare field, which was set aside as a wader enhancement area for RSPB priority species, including curlew, lapwing and skylark. What could have been a controversial solar farm proposal ended up actually securing cross-party support across the board, with some members at committee on that particular occasion, actually expressing how much they were looking forward to being able to walk through the enhanced biodiversity in that area once the development had been brought forward. So these examples of working with sectors and developing exemplar projects can be really, really helpful from an advocacy point of view, when you can demonstrate what actually can be achieved and what can be done when you actually get things right and that things are commercially viable. So, coming to a conclusion, the fixes with the planning system. I mentioned it's not perfect. It is in need of some reform. What do we need? Well, firstly, I think we need to move to a position where development is not seen as something that has to be in opposition to nature, or that nature has to be a barrier to development. We need to get to a position where we begin to look at how nature and development can come forward together and complement each other, and actually create nature positive places that people actually want to live in and can thrive in. So I think we need a change in mindset for a start. But we also need more technical and tangible things within the planning system. We need a move to more strategic spatial planning across land and sea, driven, I would argue, by national spatial plan. So getting away from just planning at a local level, with local planning policy informed by national planning policy too, but being able to plan strategically closer to the scale through a number of councils working together, closer to the scale at which natural systems actually operate. So a move back to strategic spatial planning, which we had prior to 2010, would be really useful. More investment in environmental planning, particularly better resourcing of local planning authorities and statutory consultees, to strengthen the protection of important sites for nature. We do have good quality, fit for purpose designations, SACs, SPAs, etc. Problem is, the planning system doesn't give those sufficient weight and strength. There are so many caveats built into national planning policy that in almost all occasions, a reason can be found, a justification can be found for building or developing or impacting on some of our most important sites. So I think we need to strengthen that protection within the planning system itself. We need better environmental assessment and data. We have fit for purpose legislation for environmental assessment, such as environmental impact assessment, but it's not always implemented terribly well. So I think there are things that can be done to better implement existing mechanisms. We also need to improve the quality of environmental data and accessibility to it for all. And we have our own proposal for that called Environmental Observatory. And we need to front load nature in project design from the outset in all cases. So we actually build that in from the outset. And I think there's an example on that slide of a Swift brick, which can be installed into a new property for as little as 20 quid. No problem there from a viability point of view whatsoever. And multiple gains for both homeowners and nature if we do those sorts of things. So that's me. A quick overview really of the planning system, how it operates, what it needs. Thank you for listening, and I'll hand over back to you, John.
Hey, thank you very much, Carl. Very interesting. We won't, if you want to put questions in chat, we'll do them at the end, but we'll go through all four presenters first, then we'll start questions. Okay, so if you've got some questions there for Carl, but very interesting. Thank you, Carl. So, Jonathan, we'll let you introduce yourself. Thank you very much.
Okay, hi everyone. What I'd first like to say, Carl knows a lot more about planning than I do, but operating as a house builder at a small level means I have my own views and own experiences. I also sort of prepared this before I've been away trying to catch one of those Atlantic salmon John was talking about, and I'm slightly behind, but verbally, I'm afraid it's not on the slide. I've got some interesting stuff to bring to the discussion at the end. So I had a construction and a house building business, and over time, I've got involved with planners a number of occasions. However, what I didn't put on the slide was that I've also been a trustee of the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust, and I'm what they call I enjoy shooting. Been involved in pheasant shoots and grouse shoots, and some people might find it curious, but when it comes to curlews, you can say it's not curious at all. I'm massively into conservation. I love wildlife, and the rented moor we had saw the first hen harriers breed in Derbyshire. I've watched a peregrine take its first ever flight. In fact, I rang up the raptor protection guy and said, there's a young peregrine flapping around on the ground up here. What do I do? And he said, leave it, it's fine. It's what they do. The mother will keep an eye on it. So, and anyway, all that background led me to meet Mary Colwell, who's become a friend, and we've walked the moors together. And I regret to say, where we are, we've got less curlews now over the last 7 years than we have before. And despite the fact we're allowed to do some crow sorting out and fox culling, I'm not sure what the breeding success is, even in a keeper managed grouse moor. So that's sad. Anyway, I'll get back on to so Carl's already done this, so I'll whiz through it. But basically, from where I sit, the natural policy framework dictates planners have to produce a certain number of sites. Plans are developed, numbers are developed, and local councils have to deliver those homes. Currently, the rule is if they drop below the target, other sites can be introduced. The biggest thing that will reduce development in this country is to reduce the requirement for 300,000 homes a year. And the current process, as Carl mentioned, is a muddle, undermanned, and I think it's fair to say, well, it's not fit for purpose. So that's for sure. Again, as Carl mentioned, planning applications have statutory consultees. Frequently, those are listened to, and again, as Carl said, sometimes they're not going or not given enough credence, and I'd accept that. Interestingly, the water companies are our consultees, so we won't want to get diverted into that, but they know about all the developments and are asked about them. Anyway, coming on to the subject of biodiversity net gain, we now have to produce a 10% improvement on biodiversity for a site, and to achieve that, there is a formulaic approach, and I actually got the results of the first one I've been involved in today, so apologies it's not on the slide. The site is abandoned farmland. The farmers gave up because the locals were shooting their cattle and pigs, and it's just abandoned. It's next to a town, and we are going through the planning process with it. What is interesting, they split the area up into 3 sections: hedges, trees, and greenfield. I don't know if that's how they always do it, and each section there has to be this improvement. And I found out today the wetland area, the hedges, wetland, open space. The wetland area has satisfied an improvement with what's been suggested, and the woodland and trees have been accepted as the plans will improve it. But the green fields, if you like, albeit they're not now, have failed. And therefore you start looking into, you can actually buy in BNG units. And I think this is quite interesting. So I'm going to skip over point 2 here, because the final point here, this BNG system actually is, I think, possibly positive for both parties. BNG system actually is, I think, possibly positive for both parties. okay, we're building on land and that's not good, but that's just going to happen as long as we need homes. But the biodiversity net gain means what it means. If you can buy units, you can funnel money into a identified organization that will put that money to bear and into developing its own, improving its own biodiversity achievement. And what news I got today is we are talking to the Derbyshire Wildlife Trust. They have got 4 sites around Derbyshire that will accept biodiversity units. They cost, I don't think it's confidential, £28,000 a unit. So you go through all these formulas, but this site will be giving money to Derbyshire Wildlife Trust to improve one of the farm areas they've got. And coincidentally, the lady there was very helpful, said they've actually got curlews on a farm in relatively lowland Derbyshire that first nest failed, second nest they have chicks. I did point out to her, in my opinion, that's not a success yet. It will be when they fledge them. But, you know, we were chatting. And so there is a real live example of a positive coming out of it. And as I put here, I think with the general population becoming more environmentally friendly and whatever, it is a sales point, I think, indeed, for a house builder to make use of. Right, this is my summary before I got the news today, and that is house building is usually next to towns or cities. As I say, the site I'm talking about is walked over, yomped over, air rifled over. I'm sure there is wildlife. Of course, there is wildlife there. But when it comes to curlews, which we're talking about, I doubt they'd hang around there very long. But the contribution that's being made will help a place where they might possibly thrive. So that's a personal view. Sorry, my slides didn't match what I wished to say. And thank you for listening.
A very pertinent subject, and great news you got that today as well, because one of my big questions is going to be, how do you actually go off site and how do you benefit? So it's a great example. Thank you very much. We're going to Chloe next then, please.
Okay, so I'll just give a quick introduction to myself. So I've been working with wildlife since 2003, where I started working at the Sandwich Bay Bird Observatory. From there, I started as a consultant ecologist in 2005, which brought me up to the Peak District. I was undertaking the usual things that consultant ecologists do, all the protected species and habitat surveys, which also includes breeding and wintering bird surveys. Also coordinating larger scale surveys, which included one in the Southwest Peak for waders specifically, and that was for the Peak District National Park. I'm also a licensed bird ringer, and I use my licence partly to ring barn owls for the Staffordshire Barn Owl Group as part of their monitoring. And I've also just recently this year signed up with the RSPB as a volunteer wader warden at a farm just south of Buxton, where we have a good population of lapwing. There's also curlew and snipe on the site as well, so that's been something really interesting to get involved in. So I'm just going to briefly go through some of the ways that consultant ecologists try to safeguard birds on development sites and the areas adjacent to those sites, and some of the considerations we have in that. So initially, when we have a site that's new to us, we need to find out a bit about what species there might be in the general area. So we would do a desk study that would flag up any species records. We'd also look at the general area of the site, the size of the site, and we would then come up with a level of survey effort to help us gauge the best we can of how important that site is for birds. So obviously all of our birds are protected whilst they're breeding, so curlew are no exception to that. We would also be looking at the red and amber list species and the priority species. Priority species have a material consideration with planning, so curlew are included in that. So if they're on our site, then they should ensure that the mitigation is as best as it can be for those. We'd also be looking at protected sites, which may be adjacent to our site or within a certain radius of our site. There's a possibility that SPA species may be using our site, which would prove a functional link. So we would then be looking in a bit more detail with that, with potentially doing a screening or a habitat regs assessment or appropriate assessment. It's a possibility that, again, curlew could crop up in that situation. So when we're looking at the potential impacts of developments, obviously the majority of developments will result in some kind of habitat loss, which will be displacing birds into adjacent areas. But the impacts go beyond just the habitat loss. So I thought I'd just explain some of the other things that we would be looking at with various types of developments. So with residential developments, they tend to increase the level of disturbance. So you'll have more people walking in a general area. Most likely those people, or a proportion of those people, will have dogs, which they may have off lead. People may also have cats as pets as well, which will obviously be roaming free. So that's going to create a risk to young birds, especially ground nesting birds. The other issue with disturbance is also distracting the birds, leaving their chicks potentially unattended for longer. Also with extra footfall from people as well, that may have a general impact on the habitats and the suitability of them. There may be more rubbish that's left there and other types of pollution as well, which would have an impact on them. For some sites, not just residential, any sites, there may be issues with hydrology as well for the adjacent areas. This may be due to extra draining that goes in, extra drainage, which may dry out the land, or sometimes it may be that development increases the waterlogging of adjacent areas. With industrial sites, it doesn't tend to be as much of an issue in terms of disturbance, but there may be more of a risk of chemical pollutions into the watercourses. There may be extra lighting, that kind of thing, which could affect species to varying levels. Many developments, if they're larger, could have infrastructures as well in relation to them. So obviously roads would be one of the main issues. As we know, with a lot of waders, once their chicks are mobile, they will move them from where their nest is into adjacent fields, which may be better for foraging. If there's roads, new roads dissecting those areas, then those curlews have got to take their chicks across the road, which is obviously a dangerous situation for them. New rail lines as well will be dissecting the habitats. There may not be as much of an issue in terms of collisions with trains or anything like that, but there will still be problems potentially with them taking their chicks to the opposite side of the railway line. Could also be extra pollution issues and various other issues with that as well. Cable routes, although these are temporary impacts, the timing of when the trenches are dug could be quite significant. If the trenches go in at a time when, say, there's ground nesting birds, in particular curlews, which have chicks, we don't want those chicks falling into the trenches. So that is one thing to consider. Another development type that's becoming very popular at the moment is solar farms. Whilst they can be still used for foraging for some species, whether they can still be used for breeding is questionable, depending on how the panels are designed. But hopefully, with some careful design work with those, it can still be used by a number of species. So some of the challenges that we might have with mitigating for birds on a site, in particular curlews. Obviously curlews need a large open space, as do a lot of ground nesting birds. So it's not as simple as species like swifts that we can put boxes into the buildings. So developers need to accept that they need to put aside quite a large area in order to accommodate them. One of the issues as well is that quite often, once a development has gone, the proposals have gone to planning, consultant ecologists don't always get the opportunity to monitor the new habitat to see if they're actually doing what they are designed to do. The exception to this is if a great crested newt or a bat licence, but generally for birds, there isn't a lot of monitoring that's required long term. Level of protection as well, I feel, can be an issue, especially as some of our legislation is out of date now. One of the members of the audience during the talk did mention about some of the legislation being out of date. I also feel Schedule 1 could be updated to include some of the more vulnerable species. Perhaps curlew could be one of those species. So obviously BNG has been mentioned a few times tonight, so I'm not going to talk about it in length. The point I would make is that I do think it has a lot of potential to be positive for curlews and for habitat creation. The types of habitats which curlews would use, such as wet grassland, meadows, they have a fairly high distinctiveness under the BNG calculations, which does mean that they would provide credits for developers. So there is potential for that, but not all of the conditions, the criteria for conditions may be in line with what ground nesting birds would want. For example, areas of bare ground, which may be good for some ground nesting birds, such as little ring plover or lapwing, that kind of thing. That would actually be a negative in terms of a condition assessment for a grassland. So because BNG is very much habitat focused, there might be some areas where it's going to be difficult to get those habitats in the condition we want for the particular species, which isn't then in line with what the ideal conditions are in terms of the habitat itself. So I think BNG should be a positive thing in general, but I just think as we're all getting to know how the whole system works and how we can play it to our advantage, it would just be a bit of a learning curve. So I've just got a couple of examples. We don't tend to come across curlew that often on our sites, but they do occur a couple of times, or have done a couple of times. So one of the main sites that we've been involved in over recent years is one that's just off the Humber Estuary SPA. So this site doesn't have breeding curlew, but they do use it in the non-breeding season. We also have ground nesting species. They're regularly lapwing, little ring plover, ringed plover, and we have had avocet attempt to breed there on one occasion as well. The main issue with this development has been it's still under construction at the moment, and there's still quite a high level of disturbance despite the fact that it's not complete. Prior to the construction commencing, many of the local people would walk over the wider area where it's actually very important for birds. They then put fencing either side of the public footpath to try and keep people to that path, which I think has reduced the disturbance to a certain extent, but there are still people there that are used to being able to walk over that wider area who continue to do so. I've been there many occasions where there's been dogs that have been loose that have flushed up hundreds of birds over the winter period. I believe that it's because of the dogs, that the ground nesting birds haven't been doing so well there in the breeding season, such as the avocets, which I don't think were successful in their breeding and then didn't come back the following year. There are proposals to move the public footpath away from its current location, which I think if they do that and they can put adequate fencing in to deter people from coming into this area, then in the long run, even when the development is completed, I think this could be a positive. On top of this, they are bringing into management additional grassland areas and creating more wetland habitat as well. So I think hopefully, if this site can be continued to be monitored in the long term, it could be a potential positive for the birds in that general area. So I'll be interested to see how the next few years develop on that site. A similar situation on the site that we've got near York, where there's proposals for a large housing development. At the moment, there's a SSSI which is designated for ground nesting birds such as redshank and curlew. A couple of pairs of curlew tend to hang around there in the breeding season, but we've not established if they actually breed, and we suspect they're not at the moment. Part of this may be because there are public footpaths going through the SSSI and quite a lot of disturbance. Also, people ride their horses through there. As part of the proposals, the developer is planning to safeguard this area, fence it off so that people won't be able to walk through there, and also create additional habitat for them adjoining onto this, which is currently arable fields. So again, if it can be managed properly and the fencing is adequate to keep people out of these areas, despite there being a significant number of additional people in the area, I think it would actually potentially be a positive outcome. So I think generally developments aren't going to be one of the key issues for curlews, but where developments are nearby to where curlews are nesting, I feel that the impacts are more significant for a ground nesting species like this than they are for many of the other species, purely because of the vulnerability of the chicks and the amount of space that they need. But hopefully we can use BNG to our advantage, and we'll see how that all plays out once we all get to learn how that all works. Anyway, I shall finish my presentation there. Thank you.
Can you put up Pete's then?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Pete.
Right. Good evening. Thanks for asking me to talk. Almost didn't. I only decided last night or this morning. Got an invitation while I was away on holiday. But anyway, here we are. So I'm from the Solent, as you'll see in a minute. I thought, how am I going to do this? I've worked in nature conservation for years and particularly interested in waders. A bit about me. Okay, so a lifelong passion of nature conservation. Parents moved me to Portsmouth in 1975. I quickly became involved with local nature reserves and developed a passion in the Solent and its shorebirds. I've undertaken monthly, well, almost monthly wade accounts and wildfowl accounts. Since then, what was the Birds of Estuaries Inquiry, now the Webb Survey. I'm an active bird ringer. I train people in this. I specialise in shorebird research, and I've been running projects across the flyway from Iceland to Portugal, a lot in the Solent. I've worked in nature conservation for over 30 years, mostly managing nature reserves and managing people that manage nature reserves, largely in South Hampshire and quite a lot on the coast. And I undertake a lot of ecological consultancy work, mainly shorebird based. Okay, so I'm from the Solent, so this is the rough area. This is southern England. That's the Isle of Wight in the middle. So basically between Poole and Pagham Harbour in West Sussex, Poole in Dorset, there's over 1% of all curlews in Europe wintering, 10% of the British population. But we've seen some of the biggest declines in curlews in the UK, significant declines in the last 25 years or more. Can be around 7,000 curlews wintering in this area, large numbers in Langston and Chichester Harbour. So where do they come from? I did a quick analysis, not for this talk, but for another one, looking at BTO ringing recoveries and added in our own GPS tag birds. And obviously there's a link between Finland right through southern Scandinavia, the Low Countries, a bit further out to Poland, coming here to winter in the Solent. We almost have no wintering British birds apart from a few of our own birds from the New Forest. So what do we know about them? I will get on to planning stuff in a minute. They're highly site-faithful birds, as our data will show you in a minute. They've got a very small non-breeding breeding season range, can be just a few kilometres, and they don't seem to go anywhere. They're very long-lived birds, can live over 30 years. The British record's almost 33 years old, from date of ringing to date of last recording or death. We know from various studies around the UK, including our own here in the Solents, that it's mainly males that go inland to feed, but not exclusively, largely. A new paper produced on birds around the Wash recently showed that over 80% of the birds on fields were males, if I recall correctly, and the females largely stay on the coast. This will become relevant to my talk in a second. There's one of our birds on the left there. We ringed 14 years ago, always feeds on the same mudflat and feeds on the same pony fields every winter. This is another bird. This is pictures of the same bird. This is orange, white, lime. We ringed in Southampton Water. So this bird in the autumn and early winter, it's on the shore, and it goes on to fields in the winter and back on the shore in the spring. But it's virtually always on the same field, on the same pony field where that picture was taken there. A site I'm sure will get put up for planning shortly. It looks sort of rough and on the edge in the urban area. Can have up to 80 Curlews feeding on it. Didn't see it there last winter, but it's still about. But this just shows you how site faithful these birds are. Year after year, all those green lines are different winters. The same bird on the same farm in the same field. And here's the same bird back on the shore, along with one of its mates, which winters on the mudflat. Just to further demonstrate the site faithfulness of this bird, this is of these Curlews. This is one we've GPS tagged in the New Forest, heathland breeding bird. It's wintering here in Plymouth, and we've managed to keep this tags kept going for 3 or 4 years, and it shows just the same picture that this bird goes to the same creek and the same field every winter for the last 4 years and returns to the New Forest to the same territory every year. So these are highly site faithful birds. And I'll give you one more example before we move on. Okay, this is just one individual bird. On the left, you've got its breeding territory in the New Forest. And the left-hand circle shows it moving on to an arable field to feed, and that's the only place it seemed to feed from its GPS tracking. So going off the protected area onto surrounded farmland to feed. We think the New Forest heaths are pretty poor for food for adult birds. And on the right picture there, it shows its territory, purple, sort of top right, and it goes to Poole Harbour every winter, and it always winters in the same place in Poole Harbour and does the same pattern every year. I think we've got the picture. So around the Solent, we have many fields where these birds use, and they're functionally linked to the protected areas, the SPAs and the SSIs and what have you. Mind you, most are all through these categories. And if they're functionally linked, they should be protected, but they're not legally protected as such. And none of these fields they're using are, or very few of them, actually have a legal designation or even a county designation. So the terrestrial sites consider arable fields, winter cereals, wet meadows, could be hay fields, local dairy farm, cattle graze pastures, horse paddocks they seem to love, coastal grazing marsh, which often is protected. There we go. And the bird on the right is a New Forest chick that made it. It fledged, and it's now down on the in Seaton in the picture taken by Humphrey Sitters, a female down there. I think it's been there for 2 winters. So curlews need a variety of habitats over their life in the non-breeding season. But the use of these sites depends on various things. Is it a wet winter? If it's a really wet winter, more will go inland to feed. What's the sward height like? Are these fields being disturbed? Some years there might be, other years they're not. Sometimes there's more peregrine disturbance or dog disturbance, people walking dogs. and the position in the agricultural cycle, whether a field is now being ploughed up or whether it's being used for different cropping. And we must remember these are very long-lived birds, and populations fluctuate. And trying to base our ecological assessments, as is often the case, we need data for the last 5 years or just for the last couple of winters. It's fairly dangerous, really, for a long-lived bird because they move around a lot, and they need different things in different winters. And if we go on losing marginal sites to development or whatever loss, this is loss of resource over time. We need these sites when the populations recover, because all this work's going on to helpfully raise curlew populations again. I'm being very optimistic here, and the curlew numbers will rally again. And when they come back, there won't be any sites left for them if we keep developing them, because we say curlews haven't used them for 5 years. So back in the early 90s, I set up a group called the Solent Shorebird Study Group. We realized there were a lot of pressures around the Solent. A port development, which was one of them, and we decided, a group of us volunteers and working with NGOs and English Nature as it was then, I think the RSPB were involved, we decided to go and map all fields around the Solent being used by wintering shorebirds and Brent geese. And this is all done by local volunteers, and we did this over a number of winters, collecting a lot of data and mapping it out. This has led to something called the Solent Wader and Brent Goose strategy, which is largely now led by the Hampshire Wildlife Trust, working in partnership with others. Data is still regularly updated and mapped, but of course this is showing shifting baselines, which concerns me somewhat, because it's now showing that some fields are no longer used and maybe they're okay for development. The Solent Wader and Brent Goose strategy is now part of local authorities. It feeds into their local plans, and it's frequently referred to in development and development proposals and whatever. And so if there's a proposal on a site that's flagged up as a Brent Goose or a Wader site, the person or the organisation proposing the development has to show how they're going to mitigate for any damage, or it won't get developed at all, or may not. I don't know. Anyway, the loss of any fields, even low-use fields, is a significant loss of resource. So this is what we've ended up with. We've had lots of maps, and these are available on the internet. And these are all different maps of fields where people have provided data, whether some of it's been collected by consultants over the years to back up all the voluntary effort. So each of these different coloured fields, if they're bright coloured fields, it means they get more use. But the colours and the plans change with time. You see, they've all got different compartment numbers. Red dots, I guess, where data has been entered. But if I've circled 3 sites here, so we start with the top one, which is now purple. That was a housing development proposed. This is Havant Borough Council. This is Langston Harbour, Portsmouth on your left there, for I think 800 or 900 houses on this site. It was having at one point 150 curlews using it, and 300 Brent geese, and quite a lot of lapwings, a few golden plovers. And well, I was quite shocked that this should be put forward for a planning application, so I rallied the troops and tried my best to get other people involved. I'll talk a bit more about that later. But at the moment, it's the local plan has failed. Is in the local government, the inspector decided it wasn't fit for purpose, and they've had to start again. The circle below that, these are Brent Goose and Curlew fields. These got planning permission on them, and they left a small bit. You can just sit almost just outside that little bit of the circle there by the roundabout. It was left for the shorebirds, and it's never been used by any shorebirds. That was the agreed mitigation with the ecologists and Natural England. But there we go. And the one on the right there hasn't had curlews on for a while, but always was a high tide roost for curlews and feeding oyster catchers, and is now proposed for a housing development. So it gives you a flavour of what we're up against. And these low-lying sites on the coast, many of them are only up to, at the most, 5 metres above sea level. Many of them are only 1 to 2 metres above sea level. But we seem to be trying to cram more houses onto Haley Island and other places. And there's no sea defence either. Many of them actually flooded last winter. but it's still used by shorebirds. So if you want an action plan to do anything, I'm not sure if anyone's listening is actually interested in doing anything about this. Go and find out where these birds are using, collect some data, create some maps, share it with your biodiversity information centre and local wildlife trust, whoever, ornithological societies. And why not try to get them designated? These are sinks we use here, sites of importance for nature conservation. Hasn't really happened in the Solent. Some have been designated, but majority have not, because they've gone over to the Solent, Wader and Brent Goose strategy mapping. So if a site is actually threatened with development, or you're worried it might be, basically engage yourself in the planning process at the earliest possible stage. So this means getting involved with the consultation for the next local plan and actually making effort to comment and getting others to do the same. For individual planning applications, if you want to comment, make sure you mention the planning application number. Some people sometimes forget, and do it within the deadline. Otherwise, it will just be ignored. And if you are opposed to a certain development, you have to use the word object. Otherwise, it won't be counted as such. And you can always quote the local authorities' environmental policies and plans back to them and say you object under whatever category in their plan, and make it look more useful and planning speak. And if you want to, get the NGOs or Natural England, county bird clubs, wildlife trusts, whoever else. Why not the Curlew Forum involved, as I did for Campdown in Havant, and it seemed to work quite well. And I even engaged the International Wader Study Group, and they had some international objections coming in. I didn't use social media, but of course many people can. So there's many threats to the Solent curlews with terrestrial habitats. I don't just mean housing developments. I mean development per se, and there's industrial developments, and we had a threat for a football ground, Portsmouth City actually, Portsmouth Football Club some time ago. Recreational disturbance is a really big issue, and many fields, I can show you fields on Haley Island that used to have really significant wader roosts and feeding birds like curlews on, have nothing now, but they're just walked every day by dog walkers, usually loose, with no permission from the farmers, because it's becoming more urbanised. I've mentioned sea level rise. But there we go. So functioning habitats, they should be protected, as in through the planning system somehow. You need to flag it out and work hard. I think it's just credits. Oh, there we go. Lots of people involved in all these projects, lots of organisations, including GWCT, which you mentioned earlier. I've worked with the Port, the Hampshire Ornithological Society, Forest Commission, etc. And many people are involved in these projects to provide this sort of data. So great, thanks to all of them. Okay, that's me done.
Pete, thank you. Really interesting. Absolutely. And smack on the context of this call. Megan, should we switch then to, have you got any questions come up on the chat?
Okay, so Fran, it was quite a long answer from Carl, but it was a question about, is there one party we should think about voting for in the forthcoming general election which might prioritise the nature-friendly aspect that is missing? For example, is voting Green a wasted vote? And Carl, as a representative of the RSPB, isn't able to offer a view on who to vote for, but does recommend reading the manifestos that are in the process of being published. I think not all of them are out just yet.
It's a loaded question, Carl.
That's that's correct, Megan. So far, we've had the Conservatives, the Lib Dems, and the Greens. Labour and Reform still to publish theirs. So we don't have a complete picture yet, in all honesty. But there's a big variety in the ones that we've seen so far. Let's just leave it at that.
And I just add something to that, because obviously no one's going to, particularly on this call, say who they think you should vote for. But what I would say, it doesn't matter who gets in out of all the political parties. What we're talking about tonight will still be a fight and need our resources and effort to push. It doesn't matter where it comes from. We'll have to just keep pushing. That'll be my answer to that.
Could I just pop in one?
Yes.
So let's just hope whoever gets in actually manages to run a government that actually does something. So, for example, we've had 12 housing ministers in 13 years. And I've spoken to 2 of them with issues during COVID, and it was completely pointless because they both moved on within months. So I'm not saying who to vote for, but I've already said, I think here, Colin and I definitely agree the planning system's knackered. I think we do. And the government, someone's got to get in who's going to be there for 5 years, who listens to everyone and makes sure the real things, picks it up and makes things happen in a sensible planned direction. Anyway, there we go. So it's not political, it's government we need.
Mary has added a question. Carl mentioned the need for better environmental assessment. Can you expand?
Yes, I can a little. 2 parts to this one, really. I think we need better environmental assessment, but actually more importantly, we need environmental assessment done better. One of the situation that we're in is that the legislation that governs how environmental assessment is undertaken, whether that's strategic environmental assessment or environmental impact assessment, is fundamentally fit for purpose, but it tends not to be implemented that well. So what we end up with is very, very long, large technical documents, massive weighty sort of blunderbuss approach type documents, which are produced by consultants to ensure that they've covered every single possibility, I guess, real belt and braces jobs, but spend a lot of time covering issues which are not directly relevant to the case, and tending to hide and bury and mask those that tend to be. All of those issues can be ironed out through better implementation, and I think it's that better implementation that we need to see. So things like mandatory scoping, ensuring that there's agreement at the top as to what are the things that assessment needs to consider and focus on, and what are the things that it doesn't, so that we don't waste time and resource and divert attention basically away from the things that really matter. So I think there are things that we can do to improve current systems, and developers, not sure what Jonathan's view is, but certainly the general picture that we're getting back from developers is that they broadly agree with that. They understand existing systems. They are broadly systems that are used globally. Certainly environmental impact assessment is. But yeah, there are issues in terms of how they're actually implemented. They are overdone sometimes and ill-focused. But how do we put this now? The past government was proposing under the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act, as it is now, has given powers to actually sweep away the existing systems and replace them with a wholly new and untested and novel approach called environmental outcome reports. Now, nowhere around the world really has done this before. And what it does is not so much measure impact on species or habitats on the ground, but tests it against a set of indicators that are set by politicians, which can be gamed, changed over time, etc. We would much rather have a system that is focused on direct impact rather than testing against political indicators. And also a system that is widely understood, has years of case law established and built around it, and is as I say, capable of actually just simply being implemented better. So let's not replace it with something completely new and untested that will take years to implement and fully understand and create all sorts of uncertainty for investors and developers. But let's just do what we've currently got better and smarter and more efficiently with lighter touch but better focused documents. So I think that's really what I was trying to say, Mary.
Any other ones, Megan? I got a couple of questions, Megan, unless you've got some more there.
Yes, so there's one from Roger, and it's aimed at Jonathan. Is it worth preempting what the issues are going to be, and then seeking out the interested local NGOs and bodies before even launching planning applications?
My answer is, I think it is. You want to, if you're looking at a site, you try and understand what the all the implications are, and there are so many all over the place, not just wildlife. So I think it does make sense to check absolutely if there's anything of that's going to provide you a difficulty. I would observe that developers get very, you end up being quite tough on these things, because there are two species that are supported massively when it comes to planning, bats and great crested newts. And there's a huge amount of power with those two subjects, which are frequent, as I understand it, great crested newts are absolutely very common in this country, but people have to go through a huge thing with that. And with bats, I've built a hole for a development. I wasn't the developer, I was the contractor. We've had to go and build a whole replacement barn for them for a rebuild pub thing, and then the bats buggered off anyway. So this is me being slightly caustic, but I don't know, Carl, if you've experienced this, but bats and great crested newts have this huge power and stop things for years, and you wonder why. Badgers, actually, if I'm looking at a site, I walk around looking for badger sets because they've got a great planning power. But having heard Pete, curlews haven't. But curlews are red listed, and yeah, some of those other species we've talked about are not. So shows you. So you do get caught up in things. You think, well, this isn't really an issue, but anyway, there we are. It's good to look before, absolutely.
Anything else,
I think if I could jump in as well, John, I think that's also where strategic planning can actually play a greater part. So if we have better strategic planning systems that are able to provide greater clarity as to where appropriate locations for development are and support and encourage that, and where they're not and support and encourage that, that gives greater confidence to investors and developers in the first instance, avoid some of the costs associated with going to places that are ultimately going to be problematic, and avoids harm to nature, environment, and other sources too. So I think more strategic planning would also help with that issue as well.
Okay, so we had a comment from Mike. He says, one problem in an inquiry in which I was involved in is that designation of protected areas like SPAs are out of date. The SPA involved was designated in the 1990s. However, bird populations have changed since then, so they need to be updated. And then he goes on to say, problem is that Natural England is chronically understaffed and just hasn't got the time. What are the thoughts on that?
Well, I've got one. If it breaks the silence, I'm hogging it a bit, but if it breaks the silence, there was a review of SPAs undertaken in 2016, which looked at the fitness purpose of those, and also what changes to them needed to be made, including taking functionally linked land into account. We still haven't seen that properly implemented. So some of that work's been done, but it still hasn't been followed through. I think there were indications immediately before the election that actually there may be some movement on that, and it may be beginning to get somewhere, but it's still an awful long time since 2016. So the work's been done. It seems to be more about the political will to actually follow it through, I think.
Thank you, Carl. Anything else, Megan?
I think we've reached the end of the questions in the chat. So I think you said you had some. In the meantime, if there are any more questions, do pop them in the chat.
Yeah, a couple from me, probably in your area, this one, Jonathan. You mentioned the Wildlife Trust in Derbyshire, where there's a natural way you could get credits. Interesting to everyone. When you said about 28k, what is the actual what size? What is that unit? And the other question I had was, if, as I would imagine, a lot of developers, it doesn't necessarily make sense to have that BNG net gain on the actual development there, the site they're developing. Are we not in danger of having a massive competition for BNG credits, and where are all those sites? It almost follows from the last question as well. Is there like a store of them that the local authorities understand? But where would you go? You know, if you're just developing somewhere, how would you know where to go to say, well, this is a place I can go and get a BNG credit, because my existing development, I can't manage it on site?
Okay, so I can't give you a clear answer now, because I was on the phone with the lady today and read the reports briefly, but I was in a meeting up in Leeds, so sorry, I'm a bit late to this. But I'll gladly forward you how these units are built up when I've got them. The lady at the Derbyshire Wildlife Trust was very helpful, but I just haven't got it yet. The GWCT also are involved, and I asked them last week, but despite they're usually brilliant, but for whatever reason, I haven't managed to get their answers. But as an organisation, I know they're aware of putting farmers in touch with these units and helping. Well, with the EU grants are going, so farmers, particularly in marginal farming, hill farming, I don't know, Carl, up in Richmond, I guess you are, up there in the hills, whether there's a bit more focus on actually looking for these sources of extra funding and putting it all together. But sorry, I haven't got a clear answer. I'll send one through, and if that, for people's information when I get it.
Thank you, Jonathan. And probably the other question I had was to yourself, Pete, was, and by the way, fascinating data showing us all that data where the curlews are. So you part of your Solent Wader and Brent Goose Society, you've inserted yourself, as I understand it, into the local planning so that you have a voice, and a lot of what we're talking about tonight is having a voice. And maybe that's something we could all look at broader, and maybe in your area, Carl, in the RSPB, is, we probably have areas where there is a good voice, like the Solent, and you'll have them there. And I'm sure we got gaps in the country as well where we don't have a voice, and that might be something we could look at, sort of broaden that. So really interesting what you talked about there, Pete.
Yeah. I wouldn't consider myself to be the voice now, but we've achieved it through through volunteer effort, and it's now been taken on into the planning system by the wildlife trusts and others, and it's reflective glory there. That's good news, but it's good for the curlews, I hope, and other species. But my concern is that the way these things are now assessed is there much there now, and if not, if they haven't been there for a while, we'll be dropped off the list. And this is not. We're looking at long-lived birds and other species, like equally long-lived, and they need a suite of sites which will change with time, and depending on their availability and their state. But it concerns me. But there we are. I mean, yes, I'm sure there's opportunities for other people to do similar things around the country. It's been fascinating to be involved with, and it's we're still collecting information, and it's a good use of bird watching time. Getting out there in fresh air and collecting this stuff. But I don't know. I mean, the biodiversity next gain. So I was just going to ask a quick question. How do we who determines what a unit is? Is that on a hectareage, or the value of the land that already exists? And who determines how much a unit costs? Is this determined by a local wildlife trust or government? Or sorry to cut across. I mean, I if you don't mind me asking.
Don't know. Sorry.
Okay.
I'm sorry to
it's
be
so new.
unprepared, but literally, as I say, I got sight of reporters driving back from Leeds this afternoon. I pulled over and had a chat to the lady,
Right.
and it was determined by our ecology consultant that we were missing. We weren't 10% up, we were 7.5% down, and one unit is 10%, and therefore we're going to contribute 20 grand, which is 75% of 28. I mean, the value that Derbyshire Wildlife Trust has come up with. So sorry, I'm undercooked for this meeting. I apologise. I will forward it when I've got it.
I mean, some years ago, I was involved in the planning process locally when I worked for Hampshire County Council for their countryside service, and I had to comment on various plans and things that were adjacent to nature reserves. And we managed to do very successfully through PPS 9, I seem to remember. And we worked very closely with a developer and housing developer. And I think it's mutually beneficial. They got their development. We got a lot done for biodiversity. It sounds very similar to biodiversity net gain. And we came up with a figure amongst ourselves we were mutually happy with, I think. And this seems like a similar system, but I don't know. PPS 9 presumably is long dead.
Yeah, I presume so.
Carl, have you got your hand up there?
Yeah, if I can just shed a little bit of light on that, if it helps just to explain a little bit about the net gain system, it's driven by an algorithm, biometric, which has been developed by Natural England and DEFRA. So that is used to measure the biodiversity value of a site before development. You then have to propose improvements to that site that generate a 10% uplift, at least a 10% uplift against that metric. So that's how the units and the change that's required is determined. That has to accompany a planning application as a biodiversity net gain plan, which has to be approved by a local planning authority. But it's up to habitat providers to then set the price. So, and there's a growing market for this now, both with nature charities, which are Wildlife Trust and ourselves and others, but also the private sector getting involved as well. So they will set the price that they are prepared to sell their units, their credits at. So it's then up to the developer to decide who he or she wants to buy from. So
and presumably, Carl, that would include the 30 years maintenance of that site by whoever's providing it as well, yeah?
Yeah. That 30-year maintenance has to be secured as part of that planning agreement. So you need to make very clear how that's going to be secured and delivered during a 30-year period. It's also worth saying that off-site provision, the emphasis should be, according to the government, on-site first, but where you can't deliver on-site, then you go off-site. Off-site provision has to be registered on a public biodiversity net gain register. So that's also useful too, I think, to be aware of too.
Okay, any other questions, anybody?
So Mary has added another one for Pete. Are you confident that you can protect the wintering curlew in the Solent? Are many birds from Europe that we legally have to protect?
Are we confident? I would say no. I would hope. Well, we can try hard, but the threats or the problems, challenges that we have. I mean, one, of course, is sea level rise, and many of these sites may well disappear that they're using, both intertidal and the terrestrial sites. I'm slightly concerned about biodiversity net gain, because if this is considered, we'll just mitigate for the loss of a field with some curlews on by providing some money to, I don't know, the Wildlife Trust or the County Council to do something elsewhere. Well, these birds are highly site faithful, and will they go somewhere else? The work done at Cardiff Bay many years ago on redshanks showed that they did go somewhere else, but they didn't last very long. They colour-ringed them all, and they perished much more quickly than the redshanks at the new site. So there's something called carrying capacity, and so I'm slightly concerned about these things, but I don't know. I mean, it's we try our best, but I'm not confident is the answer. Sorry, Mary.
Okay, anyone else, Megan?
I think we've reached the end. Carl added a bit of information, which I'll just read out for the benefit of the recording. We also have guidance available to all to help volunteers and communities engage the planning system, both local plans and applications. As Pete says, local evidence is always vital.
Thank you, Carl. All right, well, look, Carl, Jonathan, Pete, and Chloe, sorry we couldn't hear you. Thank you so much for contributing tonight. I found it absolutely fascinating. I will do a summary of this call. I think it's just really, really useful information and got into areas we haven't maybe gone into before, but for particularly B&G is new and valid for everybody, the development. And Pete particularly looking at, we obviously for very good reasons on chick productivity, look at curlew breeding sites as a prime importance, but bringing into some of those questions of sometimes small areas of land which are used for roosting or wintering populations is also very important. And then how do we work with the planning? Well, thank you all very much, and have the rest of the evening, and speak to you all soon. Cheers, guys. Bye-bye.